Hey, welcome to our next study. I'm Patty Baker. This is where we study the ancient texts that have been bound together into a book we know as the Bible. This is not just surface reading. This is where we slow down, open the book, read the text, and allow it to examine us before we try to apply it to everyone else. So if you're ready to think, reflect, and grow, let's dive in. Last week, we looked at Acts 27, verse 3. Just as a quick review, if you'd like to check out this study, it is under February 12th, 2026, which is the last study that we did. And it's called Relationships Are Built Through Character and Conduct. This is where a centurion, a Roman centurion soldier with authority, is taking a prisoner named Paul to Rome to stand trial before Caesar. And this was at Paul's request. And we talked about how last week the centurion showed kindness to Paul when they landed at a port for a stopover for a couple days. And Paul was allowed to stay with some local friends there to give him food, rest, encouragement, supplies, and rest really before he got back onto the journey to Rome. So Paul had already proven himself as being respectful and cooperative, and he posed no escape risk. Julius saw no criminal behavior. Julius was the centurion. Paul wasn't free. I mean, he's a prisoner, but he's trusted. And this provision that Paul is receiving while he's in port, we talked about how sometimes our own provision doesn't come from the miraculous that we're waiting, some big hallelujah moment. Sometimes it comes through ordinary people and through community. And Paul is allowed to go and stay with his friends to provide for his needs. That's not a supernatural escape. It's not angels falling from heaven and unlocking the chains that have bound him. This is just people caring for Paul in ordinary ways. And I say just, but it's a huge thing because we talked last week about how sometimes we wait for dramatic intervention when really God is actually providing provision in practical ways through our friendships, relationships, and community support, which is why it is so very important to make sure that you are building relationships too. Not because you're going to need them in the future, but because that's how we're bound together, is in relationship with one another. That's how we're created in humanity. Paul was also humble enough to receive the help. And that was our last point last week, and also going to continue on in this week. Accepting care, accepting wisdom, accepting gifts, anything, help, it requires humility. And that means letting your ego set aside, your pride set aside, and receiving what is being given to you. So that was last week. If you're interested, check out that study. Now, Acts 27 verses 4 through 21 is what we're going to go through tonight. This dynamic shifts now. So does the weather, actually. It's the beginning of storm season. And we are going to start in Acts 27 verse 4. I'm reading from what is called the Easy to Read Bible, EASY, if you're looking it up in the YouVersion app on your phone or electronic device. You can also download it to a laptop. You can find YouVersion at YOU version, and that app will come up. It has a little brown book on it with yellow word holy. You can download that. There are countless versions of the Bible on there. I'm just reading from this one, but you can choose one that is convenient or easy for you to read or understand. Verse 4. Then we traveled across the sea again, Okay, so they've left this port where they were at for a couple of days, and now they're going to travel across the sea again. It says, then we traveled. Luke is the author of the book of Acts. He's also the author of the book of Luke. And he's a physician. We know this through the writings of the text, specifically spelled out in Colossians 4:14. And he's a careful historian. When he's there and present, he is giving some pretty deep details, and we are going to read through those today. So from the beginning of the book of Luke, he says, I've investigated everything closely and I wrote an orderly account. So this mindset of taking an orderly account and investigating everything really shows up here in this chapter and in the writings that we're going to read through and study now. And this narrative here is in we. And it again signals that Luke is a part of what's happening here. He is an eyewitness. This isn't a secondhand account. And he writes it with such detail. I can't say that enough. You may feel a little bogged down in the nautical details and places tonight and directions, but these ports, these seasons, and these patterns are all important. The precision strengthens the credibility. And he wants these readers, us, to understand that this isn't just a legend or a parable. This is history. And in that history, we are going to see how the divine, the great creator, God, the Spirit, is actively at work in ordinary travel, real storms, and real decisions. So we start in Caesarea, modern day Israel, and we are sailing northeast to Rome. Let's read on. But the wind was blowing up against the ship, so we sailed round the island called Cyprus. Cyprus is an island, and they're sailing around it pretty closely because it poses as a windbreak, really, for them. So I read on. We sailed on the side of the island where the wind was not strong. When we were near Cilicia and Pamphylia, that's the southern region of modern-day Turkey now, we sailed away from the land across the sea. And when we arrived at Myra in the region of Lycia, okay, this here is near Demre, Turkey. This is down on the Mediterranean coast. The Roman officer found another ship there. So the Roman officer is making decisions for the prisoners. And this Roman officer, we know is Julius, a centurion. He finds another ship there and decides that they're going to sail this ship, okay? This ship had sailed from Alexandria and it would sail to Italy. Most likely, this ship was a large ship and it was from Alexandria. Most likely, it is a grain ship. Grain was coming out of Alexandria, Egypt, into Rome. And then from there, that grain, most likely wheat, was being distributed and sold there in Rome out to that region. So to see that there is a ship coming out of Alexandria, Egypt, and going into Italy, it would make sense that they would want to hop the ship that they're on, board this ship, which is it's a grain ship, so much larger ship, sturdier, and they're having to cross the sea now to get to Italy from Turkey, modern day Turkey. So it's also probably late September, early October, as we'll find out here in a minute. And that storm and hurricane conditions, storm season, it's winter. So a lot of high winds and storms during this time of year, heavier ship, crossing the sea, probably a better route. So this centurion makes the decision to hop on over to this ship to sail on to Italy. So the officer puts us on the ship. Again, Luke and probably a couple of other people are traveling with Paul. So it doesn't mean that they are prisoners, although they could be with him, but as a prisoner, but we're not hearing that here. It's just saying us collectively, we're going with Paul. So the officer puts us on this ship. We sailed slowly for several days. It was difficult to sail, but after some time, we arrived in Cnidus. Cnidus was an ancient Greek city located in the southwestern tip of modern-day Turkey. And it sits where the Aegean Sea meets the Mediterranean Sea. We read on. Because of the strong wind, we could not continue to sail in that direction toward Italy. So we sailed along the side of the island of Crete, where the wind was not strong. So after struggling past Cnidus because of these winds, the ship was forced to sail south, and it sails along the southern coast of Crete. We sailed past the point of the land called Salmone, or Salmone, the eastern end of Crete. It was still difficult to sail, so we sailed near the coast. And when we arrived at a place called Safeport, this is known as Fairhaven today in Crete, this port was near the town of Lasea. Lasea is in the southern region of Crete. So they've sailed from east coast along the southern route. Now they're in the center of the southern region of Crete. And they're going to follow along the southern region of Crete to the west side of Crete. They're going on to Phoenix. From there, they can now head north up toward Italy. So they're kind of taking this southern route around the island because it's safer and less winds, right? So we sailed to the point of the town of Lasea. We remained there for many days. By then, it had become dangerous to continue the journey. It was already after the Day of Atonement. What does that have to do with anything, the Day of Atonement? The Day of Atonement is a religious Jewish ceremonial day. And it is also known as Yom Kippur. And it was one of the most solemn and sacred days marked on the Jewish calendar. And it is the 10th day of Tishri. That is on the Jewish calendar. On the Gregorian calendar, that falls between the end of September and the beginning of October. So it's also the end of sailing season. This is the last ship that's going to go through here to get up to Italy. And at this point, storms, these hurricane conditions were common, and travel became dangerous on sea. It's winter season, folks. We'll read on. Luke says, so Paul spoke to the army officer and to the sailors. And he said, friends, I understand that now our journey will become dangerous. The ship may break into pieces. You may lose the things that this ship is carrying, and we may even die. But the army officer did not believe what Paul said. Instead, he agreed to do what the owner of the ship and the captain said. The port was not a good place for a ship to remain for the winter, and most of the men on the ship wanted to continue on the journey. They wanted to sail as far as Phoenix, if they could get there. And if they could get there, they could stay there for winter. Phoenix was a port on the island of Crete. It was open to the sea, both to the southwest and also to the northwest. And again, they're headed to the northwest. The wind began to blow from the south, but it was not strong. So the sailors thought, now we can do what we wanted to do. We can sail to Phoenix. Now again, Phoenix they're taking the southern route around the island, and they're going to end up on the west coast of Crete, the western point, which is the city of Phoenix. So they pulled up the ship's anchor and they left port. Now, from Fairhaven, or Safe Port, to Phoenix is about 35 to 40 nautical miles if they're traveling around close to the coast line. And of course, it's a large ship. It's a grain ship, most likely. So it is, we find out later it is a grain ship, but at this point we don't know. But suffice it to say, this is a larger ship. It's carrying wheat, grain, and because of the depth of the ship, it can't get too close to the shore, just because of the depth of the sea as you get closer into ports. I read on. Then we sailed as near as we could to the coast of Crete, but soon a very strong wind began to blow, and the wind blew from the northeast, and it blew strongly across the island. The storm hit the ship very powerfully. It was not possible for the sailors to sail the ship straight into the wind, so they did not try to do that anymore. Instead, they let the wind blow the ship along. And after that, we passed the south end of a small island called Cauda. Now, this is a very small island as it relates to the larger island of Crete, but it is south of Crete. It's south of Fairhaven by about 40 nautical miles, and it's also south of Phoenix by about 50 nautical miles. So they're a little off course here for wanting just to go along the shoreline. They've cost themselves probably a good 90 miles now. So now they're in Cauda. Cauda today, by the way, is known as Gabdos, the island of Gabdos. I continue. Here, we found a place where the wind did not blow so strongly. The sailors lifted the ship's small boat out of the water to make it safe. They tied it to one of the ship ropes, and then they tied some more ropes under the ship so that it would not break into pieces. The men were afraid that that might happen. There were some places along the coast of Libya where the water was not very deep, and the ship might hit one of these places and it might break. Okay, believe it or not, this is getting pretty serious. They're like trying to put rope underneath the ship because they're afraid that it's going to break if this thing continues to get beaten up in the middle of these high waves, treacherous conditions, out in the middle of sea. The storm's pushing them toward North Africa, Libya. And they're being driven by one of the most feared hazards in the Mediterranean for maritime. And that is the sandbars and the shoals that exist along the coast of North Africa. It's very shallow there. And if you land on one of those, you're done. You get beat up in the midst of those, the ship is done. So they're being driven out. Now, they're not just 40 miles, 100 miles off course. We're talking North Africa from Crete, like 175 to 200 nautical miles off course south. This is how violent this storm was. I continue. So they took the ship's largest sail down, and then they let the wind blow the ship along. I mean, why are we fighting this storm? Let's just let it go. The strong storm continued to blow against the ship. The ship was carrying many things. So the next day, the sailors threw some of those things into the sea. We got to lighten this thing. it'll raise the ship up, right? We're making it lighter, so heavier, it sinks. Let's raise it lighter so it's not hitting anything shallow when we're coming in. We don't want to crash this ship and kill us in the process. So this is what they're doing there. The day after that, they took hold of the sails and the ropes and they threw them into the sea. For many days, we did not see any sun or any stars. The storm continued to blow strongly. So then we thought, it's not possible for us to remain alive. And the men on the ship had not eaten any food for a long time. That's important that Luke notes this. There's a couple things going on here. When adrenaline is high, as it would be here, and survival mode is activated, hunger shuts down. That's a physiological thing that happens to the body. They're not feasting, they're fighting for their lives. And it's very likely, secondly, that they were unable to prepare food. They have grain, which means they would need to grind it, which means they would need to cook it, which means they would need to light a fire. And they're out there getting crashed on by waves, bouncing around, thrashing back and forth. A storm like this, with the ship being battered, is not a time to be preparing a meal. So that would have been nearly impossible. And lastly, who's hungry? I'd be more seasick than anything in this condition. Plus, they're worn out. So it just gives you a little backstory Luke is telling you about what's happening here in this situation. I read on. So Paul stood in front of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me!" Exclamation mark. "We should have not sailed away from Crete." Hello? I told you in Fairhaven we should have stayed there, but no, y'all wanted to leave, and here we are. "If we had not left there, the ship and everything on it would still be safe." I'm going to stop here in verse 21, because this is where we can kind of take a look in. Would you have listened to Paul back in Fairhaven when you know you're 40 nautical miles along the shoreline from hitting a much better port for us as a larger ship to be able to park for the winter? Because at that point, we could go northwest or southwest. Northwest is where we're headed because we're going to Italy, but we're in a much better position there to hole up for winter. That's rational. Paul's a prisoner, okay? He's not the owner of the ship. He's not the captain of the ship. He's not even one of the sailors on the ship, and he has no financial investment in this ship. He has no ranking authority. If you're the centurion, Julius, responsible for delivering prisoners to Rome, who do you trust? The ship owner? The captain? The majority opinion of the sailors? Or a prisoner? So no, at first glance here, as you're looking at the text, most of us would not probably have listened to Paul. Doesn't make sense to. But here's where humility enters. The prisoner was right after all. Humility is not blind submission to any sort of claim. That's not what humility is. It's not submission. And humility is not just throwing away wisdom that is of value based upon skills, experience, and training. What humility is a willingness to seriously weigh a voice that has no hierarchy or status. That's humility. The centurion didn't have to obey Paul, the prisoner, but he could have paused. As I started this study, we did a story of what happened in the last study, which was that this centurion trusted Paul. He trusted him enough to let him go a couple days with his friends at one of the ports and come back because of what he knew about Paul through his character, through his conduct. He also most likely knew why he was there for spiritual reasons, and he trusted Paul. But he doesn't humble himself to hear from a prisoner. He could have paused. He could have said, Paul, what are you seeing? Paul, why are you perceiving this? Let's consider the timing and where we are based upon what Paul's saying. No. The failure here was a lack of curiosity to ask those questions. And the failure here was complete dismissal of what Paul was saying. And that's human nature for all of us. We overvalue credentials. We overvalue ownership. We overvalue expertise. We overvalue the consensus of the majority. And we undervalue character. We undervalue the pattern of integrity that Paul had shown. We undervalue someone's spiritual maturity. We undervalue what I would call low status wisdom. That's wisdom that doesn't have a ranking by all human nature. Humility to receive means that you are willing to slow down long enough to test what someone says, even if they outrank you socially in the wrong direction. That's hard because humility threatens our ego, and ego is fueled by pride. So if the prisoner is right and the captain is wrong, the hierarchy kind of feels unstable, doesn't it? And Paul's not seeking mutiny here. Humans instinctively do this. It's part of our humanness. Here's the point of self-reflection for you and for me. Be honest with yourself for a moment. When someone without status speaks into your life, do you slow down and weigh it? Or do you discount it instinctively? If the truth came from someone beneath you in rank, in income, in education, in influence, I had somebody come up against me saying, hey, you don't have children, you've never been a parent, you don't know. Instinctively. If someone came to you beneath you in any of those areas, would you receive it? Would you at least consider it? Would you at least ask into it with some curiosity with what you do know in order to weigh it out? Or do you require a title in order to listen? That's the question. Because see, here in Acts 27, it's not about the storm. It's not about titles. It's not about positions. It's about how quickly we equate authority with accuracy. How we equate the majority public opinion as more accurate than the minority. The centurion didn't have to obey Paul. That's not the point. But humility would have required him to pause. So here's the real question. And let this sit. Who have you dismissed because they don't sit in the captain's chair? have you dismissed because they don't sit in the captain's chair? Acts 27 is not about anti-leadership. It's not about anti-expertise. It's not about anti-experience. It's about anti-pride. It's about humility to receive. It reminds us that truth is not attached to rank, and wisdom does not always sit in the captain's chair. That's truth. Wisdom doesn't always sit in the captain's chair. So here's how we walk away from this. Respect leadership, definitely. Value experience, absolutely. But never ignore someone with proven conduct and character when they're speaking, even if they're a prisoner. Because storms will test hierarchy in our lives. And in this storm, the prisoner became an anchor. Next week, we move into the moment where everything shifts. The storm is still raging. The ship is still breaking apart. There's no sun, no stars, and absolutely no control. And hope has been lost. We're already dumping off cargo to make the ship lighter. We're already getting rid of the ropes and the sails. And that's when Paul stands up, not with an opinion, but with a revelation. He said that an angel appeared to him, spoke to him, a promise was given, and the prisoner becomes the calmest man on the ship. And here's the tension that we're going to explore next week. Why does God wait 14 days before speaking? And why does the assurance of all of this come after all hope is gone? We'll explore those topics next week. Because next week isn't about warning. It's not about identity in the middle of the storm. It's about trusting God when nothing around you is stable. Because sometimes the breakthrough isn't the storm stopping.